Hello, you guys. It's Miss Hampson here with Sophiebug, and today we're going to be reading chapter 14 of Old Yeller, right? Chapter 14. Let's begin. We couldn't leave the dead bull to lie there, that close to the cabin. In a few days, the scent of rotting flesh would drive us out. Also, the carcass lay too close to the spring. Mama was afraid it would foul up our drinking water. We'll have to try to drag it further from the cabin and burn it, she said. Burn it? I said in surprise. Why can't we just leave it for the buzzards and varmints to clean up? Because that might spread the sickness, Mama said. If the varmints eat it, they might get the sickness too. Mama went to put the harness on Jumper. I sent Lisbeth to bring me a rope. I doubled the rope and tied it to the loop around the bull's horn. Mama brought Jumper, who snorted and shied away at the sight of the dead animal. Jumper had smelled deer blood plenty of times, so I guess it was just the size of the bull that scared him. Or maybe like Old Yeller, Jumper could scent the dead bull's sickness. I had to talk mean and threaten him with a club before he could get him any closer for Mama to hook the sling tree over the loop of the rope I tied around the bull's horns. Then the weight of the bull was too much for him. Jumper couldn't drag it. He leaned into his collar and dug in with his hoofs. He grunted and strained. He pulled till I saw the big muscles of his haunches flatten and start quivering. But the best he could do was slide the bull carcass along the ground for about a foot before he gave up. I knew he wasn't throwing off. Jumper was full of a lot of pesky, aggravating mule tricks. But when you called him to move a load, he'd move it or bust something. I called him again. I drove him at a different angle from the load, hoping he'd have better luck. He didn't. He threw everything he had into the collar, and all he did was pop a link out of his right trace chain. The flying link whistled past my ear with the speed of a bullet. It would have killed me just as if it had hit me. Well, that was it. There was no moving the dead bull now. We could patch up the broken trace or for pulling an ordinary load, but it would never be as strong enough to pull this one, even if Jumper was. I looked at Mama. She shook her head. I guess there's nothing we can do but burn it here, she said. But it's going to take a sight of wood gathering. It did too. We'd lived here long enough to use up all the dead wood close to the cabin. Now Mama and Lisbeth had to go way out into the bush for it. I got a piece of rawhide string and patched up the trace chain, and Mama said Lisbeth used Jumper to drag up a big dead logs. I helped them pile up the logs on top of the bull. We piled them up till we had the carcass completely covered, then set fire to them. In a little bit, the fire was roaring. Sheets of hot flames shot high into the air. The heat and the stench of burned hair and scorching hide drove us back. It was the biggest fire I'd ever seen. I thought there was fire enough here to burn 3 bulls, but when it began to die down, a couple of hours later, the bull's carcass wasn't half burned up. Mama and Liz went back to dragging up more wood. It took 2 days and nights to burn up that bull. We worked all day long each day with Mama and Lisbeth dragging up the wood and me feeding the stinking fire. Then at night we could hardly sleep. This was because of the howling and snarling and fighting of the wolves lured to the place by the scent of the roasting meat. The wolves didn't get any of it. They were too afraid of the hot fire. But that didn't keep them from gathering for miles around and making the nights hideous with their howls and snarls. And all night long, both nights, Old Yeller crippled back and forth between the fire and the cabin, baying savagely, warning the wolves to keep away. Both nights I lay there watching the eyes of the shifting wolves glow like the mesquite coals of the firelight and listening to weak moaning bawl of old Spot still traveling in a circle. I lay there feeling very shivery with fearful dread that brought up pictures in my mind of Bud Searcy's uncle. I sure did wish Papa could come home. As soon as the job of burning the bull was over, Mama told us we had to do the same for the spot heifer. That was all Mama said about it, but I could tell by the look in her eyes how much she hated giving up. She had great hopes for Spots making us real milk cow, making us a real milk cow, especially after Old Yeller had gentled her so fast. But that was all gone now. Mama looked tired and more worried than I think I've ever seen her. I guess she couldn't help thinking what I was thinking. That if hydrophobia had sickened one of our cows, it might get them all. I'll do the shooting, I told her, but I'm going to follow her out a days from the house to do it, closer to some wood. How about your leg? Mama asked. That leg's getting all right, I told her. I think it'll do some good to be walked on. We'll try to kill her on bare ground, Mama cautioned. As dry as it is now, we'll be running a risk setting the woods afire if there's much old grass around the place. I waited till Spot circled past the cabin again, then took my gun and followed her, keeping a safe distance behind. By now, Spot was so sick and starved I could hardly stand to look at her. She didn't look like a cow. She looked more like a skeleton of one. Oh, she was just skin and bones. She was so weak she stumbled as she walked. Half a dozen times she went to her knees. At each time I think she'd taken her last step, but she'd always get up and go on again, and kept bawling. I kept waiting for her to cross a bare patch of ground where it would be safe to build a fire. She didn't, and I couldn't drive her, of course. She was too crazy mad to be driven anywhere. I was afraid to mess with her. She might be like the bull. If I ever let her know I was anywhere but about, she might go on the fight. I guess she was a mile from the cabin before I saw that she was about to cross dry sandy wash, something like the one where Yeller and I had gotten mixed up with the hogs. That would be a good place, I knew. It was pretty far from us to have to come to burn her, but there was plenty of dry wood around. And if I could drop her out there in that white sandy wash, there'd be no danger of a fire getting away from us. I hurried around and got ahead of her. I hid behind a turkey pear bush on the far side of the wash, but as sick and blind as she was, I think I could have stood out abroad open without her ever seeing me. I waited till she came stumbling across the sandy bed of the wash, then fired, dropping her in the middle of it. I'd used up more of my strength than I knew, following Spot so far up the cabin. By the time I got back, I was dead beat. The sweat was pouring off me, and I was trembling all over. Mama took one look at me and told me to go to bed. Well, we'll go and start the burning, she said. You stay on that leg any longer, and it'll start swelling again. I didn't argue. I knew I was too weak and tired to take another walk that far without rest. So I told Mama where to find Spot, and I told her to leave little Arliss with me and watched her and Lisbeth head out, both mounted on Jumper. Mama was carrying a pan full of live coals to start the fire with. At last minute, Yeller got up of his cowhide. He stood watching them a minute, like he was trying to make up his mind about something. Then he went trotting after them. He was still thin and rough looking and crippling pretty bad in one leg, but I figured he knew better than I did whether or not he was able to travel. I didn't call him back. As it turned out, it was a good thing I didn't. Only afterwards I had wished thousand times that I could have in some way of looking ahead to what was going to happen. Then I would have done everything I could to keep all of them from going. With little Arliss to look after, I sure didn't mean to droop off to sleep. But I did, and slept till sundown, when suddenly I jerked awake, feeling guilty about leaving him alone so long. I needn't have worried. Little Arliss was right out there in the yard, playing with a speckled pup. They had themselves a game going. Arliss was racing around the cabin, dragging a short piece of fried rope. The pup was chasing the rope. Now and then he'd get close enough to pounce on it. Then he'd let out a growl and set teeth into it and try to shake it and hang on to at the same time. Generally, he got jerked off his feet, turned a couple of somersaults about. That didn't seem to bother him. The next time Arliss came racing past, the pup would tie into the rope again. I wonder if he couldn't get some of his baby teeth jerked out with such rough play, but I guess it wouldn't matter. He'd soon be shedding them anyhow. I wondered too what was keeping Mama and Lisbeth so long. Then I thought how far it was and where the dead cow lay and how long it would take just for the two of them to drag up enough wood to get the fire started, and figured they'd be lucky if they got back before dark. I went off to the spring after a bucket of fresh water and wondering when Papa would come back. Mama said in a couple of days ago that it was about that time, and I hope so. For one thing, I could hardly wait to see what sort of horse Papa was going to bring me. But mainly, this hydrophobia plague had me scared. I'd handled things pretty well until that came along. Of course, I had gotten a pretty bad hog cut, but that could have happened to anybody, even a grown man. And I was about to get well off that. But if the sickness got more of our cattle, I wouldn't know what to do. And that, my friends, was chapter 14 of Old Yeller. Thank you for reading with us, and we will see you in the next chapter. Bye.